for that very generous introduction that I did not definitely write myself. But anyway, all right. Let's get this show on the road, as they say. So, welcome everybody. So I'll start by saying a few things and then go on to introduce our speaker today. So, a dialogue with the literatures and cultures of Latin America has been a defining moment for a practice of comparative literature in India. And so as a comparatist, it gives me great pleasure to be introducing to you our first speaker. When I wrote to Andrés Claro, when I was asked to introduce him, he most graciously wrote back while changing flights in Paris. And as I was reading the details of the talk that he's presenting today that he very generously shared with me, I was reminded of my first encounter with the work of the comparatist Claudio Guillen, whose insistence on the supranational had deeply moved me. Most people tend to attribute the literary fortunes of authors like Gabriel Garcia Marquez to his winning of the Nobel Prize. I would like to say that is simply not true. His work has been a part of the Indian university curriculum since 1971. Manavendra Bandyopadhyay's translation of 100 Years of Solitude into Bangla was among the first translations of Garcia Marquez's works into an Indian language. Comparative literature in India emerged out of an anti-colonial impetus that sought to decolonize, somewhat misplaced, but sought to decolonize literary studies by expanding its horizons beyond English, which was thought of as the literature of the colonizer, to other European literary modernities. Over time, such a vision very naturally shifted from its focus to the modernities of Europe to the modernities and post-modernities of former European colonies in Africa and South America. And so I say again, I'm immensely grateful for this opportunity to introduce to you Professor Andrés Claro. He inhabits multiple vocations and avocations. He's an essayist, a poet, a translator, a philosopher, and a university professor. He did his postgraduate studies in philosophy and literature at l'École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, my French not so good, where he worked under the direction of none other than Derrida, and then went on to complete his DPhil in literature from Oxford University. His most recent work, Synopsis, collects a series of essays on poetics, translation, theories of language and culture. He's the author of two major books, The Inquisition and the Kabbalah, a chapter on the difference between ontology and exile, and Broken Vessels, 4 variations on the task, on the translator's task. He has published collections of poems and literary translations from various languages, and as Google informed me recently, he contributed a piece on Ezra Pound to a volume that was co-edited by a very dear teacher and mentor of mine, Shubha Chakraborty Dasgupta. He teaches in the doctorate in philosophy, aesthetics at La Universidad de Chile, and has held visiting professorships at universities across Europe, Latin America, and the United States. So in the spirit of hospitality, gratitude, and friendships of the mind and soul that Claudio Guillen speaks of in his last major work, Múltiples Moradas, I ask you to extend your warmest welcome to Professor Andrés Claro and invite you to inhabit his time as he inhabits ours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kumar, for this presentation. Thank you very much, Amit, for the invitation, Sanchit for all the organization. There you are. So most of you might have a handout. Don't worry, I'm going to not go through the whole of it. It's just basically that you keep track of what I didn't have time to say here. The presentation is called Genealogies of Failure, 3 Traits of the Southern Cone Literary Ethos. When the misleading locution, the New World, was applied to our continent, South America, as you know, the Spanish navigators had sought to reach parts of India. These are words of Columbus. That's the contract he had to get to parts of India, to open a new route for the oriental spices that season taste: saffron, pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves. A pretension of abundance that, after the disappointment that followed, would generate the additional misunderstanding of calling us the West Indies. Hence, our region entered the colonial imaginary under a double symbolization in conflict, which is what these denominations themselves attest to. We tensioned in our incorporation to the Western map the promise of exoticism with the realization of a failure, naming it in a relative, most of the time, negative way: the New World as opposed to the Old, the West Indies when they sought to reach the East ones, or even America, after the navigator who ventures into the cold southern seas and sanctions the error, and not Colombia, after the one who had reached the Caribbean, announcing a version of paradise on earth. On the horizon of this constitutive tension between the promise of exoticism and the realization of failure, which Latin America, or with which Latin America is incorporated and redefines the map of the West, if it were a matter of making a caricature, that is, given the short time I have here, of accentuating distinctive features in order to gain access to the subject in an expeditious manner, it could be thought that the genealogy of the promise of exoticism would find a climatic literary expression in the boom, or at least in certain emblematic novels of the boom, which, superimposing Faulkner's lesson on Spanish costumbrismo, and not entirely alien to the fantasy excesses of the European imperial epic in its search for El Dorado, the fountain of youth, the Amazons, or the lost city, would have taken to its ultimate consequences the atavistic poetics of the well or badly named magical realism that had been developed since the 1930s in South America, making the illusion of strangeness an everyday picture, throwing us with all impassivity the details of the extraordinary as if it denoted our daily lives. One could thus continue to insist on the exemplary value of 100 Years of Solitude as a recodification of our nature and our history by fiction, above all as a fable about mythical archetypes, with its hyperbolic imaginary of the marvelous sensible, where the objects and characters of a legendary village, rich in adjectives and superlative qualities, connote at all times the fantastic, where the popular and the autochthonous are carnivalized in a version of the unreal. With a family trying for generations to avoid the birth of a pigtailed child, with, this is what you have in quote number 2 there in the handout, with the sad spectacle of a man who had been turned into a snake for having disobeyed his parents. Finally, with the eruption of a very flying carpet as a paroxysmal instance of this retroprojection towards Oriental exoticism. Quote 3, this time, along with many other artifices that brought a flying carpet, but they did not offer it as a fundamental contribution to the development of transport, rather as an object of recreation. The people at once dug up at the last gold pieces to take advantage of a quick flight over the houses of the village. As with this movement that does not transport but circles around the archetypal village, temporally speaking, the acknowledged polyvalence of time through which the novel is skillfully plotted ends up constituting a ritual of eternal return, where every event before the eyes reveals directly, or in an amorphosis, an original past that repeats itself. Quote 4, I know all this by heart, Ursula foresees. It's as if time had turned around and we were back at the beginning. A whole spatio-temporal mise-en-scène that forms part of the program of political commitment deployed by the major authors of the boom, and Garcia Marquez in particular, with their faith in the explicit output and immediate social return of literature over the public arena. Quote 5, he proclaimed a new amnesty for political prisoners and authorized the return of all exiles except men of letters. Of course, them never. This is summarized in The Autumn of the Patriarch of Garcia Marquez, superimposing then the young revolutionary with the committed writer, emphasizing the subversive power intended for a discourse that denounces the origin of underdevelopment in the colonial condition, first European and then North American, another archetype that is repeated again and again until finding in the military dictatorships of the 1970s the hyperbolic version of oppressive power. The same ones that Garcia Marquez, these dictatorships, superimposes with a critical sense of humor in the anonymous protagonist of The Autumn of the Patriarch, but also the dictatorships that would install a neoliberalism that, along with sanctioning the end of the dream of a progressive literary state, replicates the very conditions of globalized trade under which the boom phenomenon occurred. An arena where, far from operating as literatures of resistance, the atavistic promises become exotic products in a global market of identities, in which they are integrated in the manner of regional bestsellers. Thus, even today, or to be more precise, last week, when one reads in The Guardian a title that literally announces what you have in number 6, this is the title from The Guardian a week ago, more than a week ago, Latin American fiction booms again on International Booker Prize long list. It is more generally clarified in the words of the prize administrator that what it follows there, the long list comprises books that speak of courage and kindness, of the vital importance of community, and of the effects of standing up to tyranny. The reasons for the crisis of such a literary program, at once emancipatory and atavistic, are undoubtedly complex and involve everything from poetics to politics. Thus, Julio Ramón Ribeiro, known for his acute testimony of the times under the symptomatic title of La tentación del fracaso, the temptation of failure, would not only describe the monumental works of the boom as, Amit reminded us in the invitation, as heteroclite, ornate, monstrous palaces, these are Ribeiro's words, but will also warn, quote 7, that if for a South American it is easier to make a revolution than to write a novel, in short, I would have wanted Garcia Marquez's dictator to be not only likable, but also detestable. It is precisely the consciousness of failure, but also of a need to insist on it as a program rather than as a unilateral condemnation, and above all, of literary failure, of a certain failure as the core of a literary discourse without concessions, that will be sharpened by a series of writers of the post-boom generation who explicitly sought to dissociate themselves from the forms and the intent of the boom. Authors who renew with that other constitutive strand of the Latin American inscription, failure itself, which has been delimited here under the rubric of bust. Thus, Alan Pauls, echoing Beckett, try again, fail better, urges us, quote 7, to be the best possible artist of failure. Because it's not just a matter of failing. No, you have to fail again and again, always, as if there were no other way of doing things. Because repetition is the evidence that failure does not depend on the will. It is not chosen, and therefore it is useless to try to placate it, to channel it, or to stop it. This error into which we keep falling is not just any error, it is our error. Roberto Bolaño, for his part, passionate about cultural and literally loose ends, who in his solitary adventure disbelieve as few in official powers, hammers it again and again in his declarations. Quote 8, the only experience necessary for writing is the experience of the aesthetic phenomenon, a commitment, or rather a bet, where the artist puts his life on the table, knowing beforehand, moreover, that he is going to come out defeated. The latter is important, knowing that you are going to lose. Stressing the way the savage detective is created out and as a testimony of the failure of his generation, Bolaño adds, quote 9, the novel tries to reflect a certain generational defeat and also the happiness of a generation, a happiness that at times delineated courage and the limits of courage. If this is an attitude that Bolaño inherits from the tension between enthusiasm and skepticism left by Nicanor Parra under the symptomatic rubric of poetry and anti-poetry, this same tension is what leads him to distance himself from the self-image of the totemic, Promethean, or even national writer, which had a strong literary tradition in Chile since Neruda and had been renewed by the main novelist of the boom. Yet another way of recognizing and sanctioning the literary failure of his generation, but also a way of making virtue out of necessity. For if the astonishment of being South American writers would come from confronting the fact that what is done fails, this failure would be part of the problem, perhaps the whole problem, the most proper and even the most precious thing one has. That would be at least the lesson of the father by elective affinities of this bust generation, the Borges factor, to sum it up with the asserted title of Alan Powell's book, or to expand it in Bolaño's words, quote 12, the territory that marks my generation is that of rupture. It is a generation that wants to leave behind not only the boom, but also what the boom generates, which is a generation of very commercial writers. It is the territory of parricide, on the one hand, and on the other hand, it is the territory of the Borgian. You have to investigate all the fringes, all the paths left by Borges. Even if I was starving, I wouldn't accept even the smallest handout from the boom, he adds. But I would live under Borges' table, reading every single one of his pages. For the first Borgian path to be explored is this conscious departure from the avenues of a boom, would be precisely his awareness of the fatality of failure, not only as a limit to the pretensions of the human, quote 13, these are words of Borges on Almafuerte, he managed to impose on himself the certainty that failure was not only his stigma, but the substantial and final destiny of all human beings, but also as a specificity of the aesthetic experience itself. In The Wall and the Books, Borges adds, quote 14, this imminence of a revelation which does not occur is perhaps the aesthetic event. If the consciousness of failure is at a core of Borges' acute sense of the paradoxes behind the representations of language, which allows him to reduce the varied repertoires of knowledge to the forms of fiction, truth to an effect of discourse, it is also what allows him to project a very different image of South America, one that can be delimited by the rubrics of estrangement or displacement, essay, and translation, three traits that allow one to continue sketching out the caricature of this alternative path to the boom deployed by the bust. Although I do not have the time here to go through these three salient traits in any detail, let me at least mark a few points about them, especially about the first, which is what you have as displacement or estrangement would be probably better. As you might recall, amid his well-known admonitions in the Argentine writer and tradition, activating his sense of paradox, Borges reviews and rebuts three common claims about what literature and culture ought to be in Argentina and in South America generally. The first one concerns exoticism, or the cult of the local color. He summarizes and replies, quote 15. So in italics, you have like this kind of cliché received idea. The idea that Argentine poetry should abound in distinctive Argentine features and Argentine local color seems to me a mistake. The Argentine cult of local color is a recent European cult that nationalists should reject as foreign. This is a position that Borges ended up extending to the literature and culture of the South American cone as a whole, rejecting any univocal or limited definition of it, especially one that would reduce the horizon of the fantastic in literature to the magical. As early as 1932, in The Art of Narrative and Magic, when magic realism was beginning, really, Borges warns the following, quote 18. The whole catalogue of these atrocious and derisory examples is impossible to enumerate. I think, however, that I have given enough to show that magic is the crowning or nightmare of the causal, not its contradiction. The miracle is not less a stranger in that universe than in that of the astronomers. All natural laws govern it, and other imaginary ones. For the superstitious, there is a necessary connection not only between a bullet and a dead man, but between a dead man and a battered wax effigy. That dangerous harmony, that frenetic and precise causality, rules in the novel as well. The second demand that Borges contests concerns the privileged or exclusive relationship with the Spanish tradition. The positive counterpart to this anti-purism is to be found in a third position of Borges, where he imposes his finis terrae cosmopolitanism. In well-known words that you might all know here, he summarizes and refutes. So first the opinion. This 23, this third opinion is that we, the Argentines, are detached from the past. According to the singular view, we Argentines are in the first days of creation. We must realize that we are essentially alone in 100 years of solitude, for instance. Many people may accept this view because once accepted, they will feel alone, disconsolate, and in some way interesting. However, I have observed that in our country, precisely because it's a new country, there is a great sense of time. I believe that our tradition is the whole of Western culture, and I also believe that we have a right to this tradition, a greater right than the inhabitants of one or another Western nation may have. I believe that Argentines, South Americans in general, can deal with all European themes, deal with them without superstition, with an irreverence that may have and is already having happy consequences. And so I say again that we must be fearless and take the whole universe as our inheritance. Certainly, and I want to emphasize this, setting out from the paradoxical aesthetics of originality as rewriting and finis terrae cosmopolitanism that Borges's particular vantage point on the river plate allows him, the dimension of conflict that has often been part of the literary experience and exile history in Latin America tends to be omitted in his words, ignoring the violence perpetrated on that which resists assimilation and inheritance, as has often been the case with indigenous cultures, while unilaterally emphasizing the outlook of skeptical tolerance that a world-scale literary movement encourages. But having said that, Borges' awareness of the extent to which South American literature and culture should be thought of as a journey through cultures refusing all boundaries between traditions and continents is characteristics of the inhabitants and of the writers of the southern cone, and particularly those of Buenos Aires, a city shaped by a succession of rapid and large-scale immigrations of Italians, Russians, Jews, Central Europeans, Asians, and others, superadded to the substrates of Spanish and indigenous descent. Resonating at the very cultural scene of the Sur magazine where Borges's text was published. The same circle where Alfonso Reyes would give a suggestive image of this spatio-temporal estrangement, one that fascinated Borges for different reasons. This is what you have in 32. He says, Alfonso Reyes, that the countryside is so vast, he refers to the plain, which the writer translated as the Pampas, that on both sides you are outside. Very nice, isn't it? On both sides of the gate, on the plain, you are outside. Going beyond Borges' Sur scene, this estrangement as a constitutive lack and opportunity of the South American, and above all of Latin American literature as a wandering between languages and cultures, is what could be traced back at least to the foundational scene in the work of the Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, who makes the utopia of the Incas a projection of the Neoplatonic order through a plot of text in a generically unclassifiable discourse, at once novelistic, philosophical, and critical, to the explicit heirs of Borges who have been named here as bust. Thus with Bolaño, who beyond the vicissitudes of his biography, beyond even the shifting accent of his voice, gravitated by the emigrations and eventually hoarsened by smoking and illness, with which he plotted Chilean, Mexican, Spanish, Catalan expressions, he delimits literature and his person through the stamp of an estrangement, of an exiled turn against exile itself. With regard to the literary task, Bolaño begins, this is 35 in page 5 of the handout. He says, all literature carries with it its exile, whether the writer has to clear out at the age of 20 or whether he has never moved from his home. Adding shortly afterward, in the same piece, at this point I have to say that at least as far as as literature is concerned, I do not believe in exile. To end up sifting through a different displacements that are actually at stake for a South American writer and those from similar regions. Quote 36, literature and exile, says Bolaño, are, I believe, the two sides of the same coin, our destiny plays in the hands of chance. Of course, in the air of Europe, there sounds a refrain, a cantinela, it's a bit despective, and it is the refrain of the pains of exile, a music made up of complaints and lamentations and a nostalgia that is difficult to make sense of. The refrain, intoned by Latin American and also by writers from other depleted or traumatized areas, insists on nostalgia, on returning to one's native country, and to me, this has always sounded like a lie. For the true writer, the only homeland is his library, a library that can be on shelves or on his memory. Translated in temporal terms, in turn, this means once again to go beyond any attempt to inscribe oneself in a close tradition. Quote 38, Bolaño, of course, I'd love to claim a literary past, a tradition, a very brief one, made up of only 2 or 3 writers, and maybe one single book, a dazzling tradition prone to amnesia. But on the one hand, I'm much too modest about my work, and on the other, I've read too much, and too many books have made me happy to indulge in such a ridiculous notion. Now, moving a bit forward, if the problem of South American literature and culture has been to find an instance of enunciation that responds to this exteriority and displacement, a writing in the margins that embodies its constitutive flaw metamorphosed into a dilettante pathos and eclectic culture, it is one can be summarized under the second rubric, the essay, in the generic and the heuristic senses of the Spanish word ensayo, which is both essay and trial, as a discursive form and as an attempt at experience without a predetermined path. On the face of it, already Montaigne's mother humorously sums up the intrinsic relationship essay would have with failure. 41 bis, whoever devotes himself to making essays, she warns her son, will not be able to obtain results. But once again, when it comes to making a virtue out of necessity, this skeptical search that starts from a perplexity without an assured destination, with its varieties of non-dogmatic, curious, and polygraphic style, this stylistic openness, far from all specialization and limits between disciplines, oscillating between the expository, the argumentative, and the poetic, in the midst of an open preferentiality, would constitute an exemplary response to the polyvalent question and an even journey which the Latin American intellectual and literary task imposes. If, as Germán Arciniega sums up, 42, our America is an essay, it is because the essay is the instance par excellence where literature not only resists the norm of discursive purity, but also where it answers the question of its place in the world, and of the world as a place and effect of literature. If this essayism that allows and delimits the status, it is this essayism that allows and delimits the status of Borges's fictions, this special gender of Borges, his avant-garde experimentation as a reader that writes, who writes while reading, with a conjectural and polyvalent effect that is projected onto the whole of experience. And it is this essayism that moves the avant-garde conception of narrative held by what has been called here the authors of the bust. Thus, if Julio Ramón Ribeiro, early author of this fantastic prosas apátridas, this stateless prosas, can also display his own skepticism towards both magic and real politics, he proposes a discursive dilettantism associated with his own consciousness of dispersion and failure. Is quote 55 on page 7. Is Ribeiro, is fantastic writer, less known obviously than the others. He said, what will prevent me, says Ribeiro, as it has prevented me so far, from what is called succeeding in life as a writer, is the dilemmatic character of my intelligence, which always proposes to me a greater number of solutions than the problems demand, without clarifying which one I should adopt. Unbreathable sentence. The final consequences of this defect is not inactivity but dispersion. Writing is inventing an author to suit our taste. And if Ribeiro can also argue that writing well is a profoundly moral act, where aesthetics and ethics mingle, I'm quoting Ribeiro, Bolaño glosses the ethical output of this narrative essayism by specifying the following, quote 56. When I speak of formal risk, I'm not limiting myself to what is commonly called experimental literature, nor am I thinking of what is commonly referred to as boring literature. Boring literature is precisely that which does not take risks. And risks in literature are of an ethical order, basically ethical, but they cannot be expressed if a formal risk is not taken. In fact, in all areas of life, ethics cannot be expressed without the prior assumption of a formal risk. If such risks abound in the testimonial and formal essayism of most of his narrative work, that which he announces as proper to 57, the novel of the 21st century, that is to say, a hybrid novel which brings together the best of the short story and journalism and the chronicle and the diary, they are also what generates new aesthetics and ethical effects when they are transferred and recreated in other languages and cultures. Which brings me to the third and last trait I would like to mark in this caricature of bust, namely what you have there as translation. For you might recall that at the beginning of the Homeric versions, limiting the scope of his usual conjectural temper, Borges states the following, 58. There is no problem so consubstantial with literature and its modest mystery as this posed by a translation. It seems translation designed to illustrate the aesthetic debate. On the horizon of his obsession with forms of duplication, if Borges situates translation as the key to the aesthetic phenomena, it is not only because of the intensity with which he exercised it in the 1930s and the 1940s, or because of the de facto importance translation has had for Argentinian literature in its relationship with world literature of which he claims to be the heir. Not to mention the way in which translation imaginaries, including betrayal and crossbreeding, have allowed to think the Latin American constitution. But also, and above all, to the fact that it is the literary operation of translation consists precisely in a productive impossibility, in a creation from or out of failure, yet another way of making a virtue out of necessity. For what does Borges have to say about it? Very few things. I mean, I'm going to just mention very few things. He wrote a lot about translation. In principle, certainly, as you have in 60 there, that if a language is a way of feeling reality, I'm quoting Borges, not an arbitrary repertoire of symbols, he liked to repeat this, then the inseparability between stylistics and semantics, between what the language says and what the language does, imposes insurmountable obstacles to the possibility of success in the task. However, acknowledging this obvious impossibility of the passage of a stable meaning and experience between languages and cultures, literary translation exists. There is even something we call the translation of poetry, a habit that crystallizes precisely by not being paralyzed by flaw and limits, by transforming the failure of the passage between languages into a possibility of creation. An obvious corollary of this awareness is that there may be many creative versions depending on the emphasis and the paths chosen. As Borges insists, this is 70 at the bottom of page 8, which of these many translations is faithful, my reader will perhaps want to know. I repeat, none or all of them. As to this, Borges' attention to failure and his preference for duplication adds a series of somewhat more provoking corollaries. First of all, he insists that translation can be often much better than the originals. Borges makes even the accusation, this is what you have in 76, Borges makes even the accusation that frequently, I'm quoting, the original is unfaithful to the translation, noting, for example, that Néstor Ibarra's text, La pérdida en rumor de la ribera, the loss in rumor of the riverbank, is inaccessible, is marvelous, is fantastic, and that his imitation by Valéry, which is actually the original, Le changement dérive en rumeur, does not succeed in fully restoring all the Latin flavor. If new edges emerge to understand how failure becomes creation then, how this constitutive failure and derivation that is recognized in South American literature as a translational ethos becomes a creative, even a transgressive program, this is what once again is consciously perpetrated by the generation of Borges's heirs that has been delimited here as bust. Thus, Alan Pauls, who cultivates the task as insistently as Borges did, the task of translation, I mean, summarizes, quote 77, "It is impossible to translate. There is not, there cannot be, there will never be a relationship of equivalence between the language from which one translates and the language into which one translates. And yet, the demand persists. It is necessary to translate. And yet translations continue, proliferate, multiply every day. The lesson, which is our relief, perhaps the only one within our reach, is that nothing creates as many new things as an impossible situation." As for Bolaño, to the inescapable awareness of loss, he not only adds his conviction that good literature resists bad translation, correcting the very example Borges took for his Pierre Menard. 78, Bolaño writes, "Borges says that there are untranslatable authors. Nevertheless, a work like Don Quixote could withstand even the worst translator. What's more, it could withstand mutilation, the loss of numerous pages, and even a shower of shit. However badly translated, incomplete, and damaged, this version of Don Quixote would say a lot to a Chinese or an African. And that is literature, undoubtedly. Maybe a lot gets lost along the way, no doubt, but perhaps that was its destiny. It arrives when it arrives." Even more suggestive and pertinent to what summons us here today, Bolaño sees in translation the very strategy to overcome the epigons of the boom. Appealing to the task of turning hesitation in the face of the impossible into a possible decision, he asks and warns, 79, for example, who are the official heirs of Garcia Marquez? Well, let's draw a veil over it. Actually, he names them, but I took it off. It's a long list. As writers, we have literally reached a precipice. There is no way across it, but we have to cross it, and that is our job, to find a way to cross it. And then specifying this reckless crossing of the abysm as a step towards other languages and literatures, quoting Piglia, he adds, 80, "How to silence the epigons? To escape, it is sometimes necessary to change the language." I have the impression that in the last 20 years, from the mid-70s to the early 90s, and of course during the ill-fated decade of the 80s, this desire is something present in some Latin American writers. Which is not to say that such a desire of translation, of crossing between South America and other languages, and Indic culture as well, have ended or will end up free of new flaws and misunderstandings. Thus, by way of a postscript, let me end today by just recalling 3 symptomatic scenes that may help to assess some of the problems that may arise as we try to make the booms and the bust between India and South America simply commensurable. The first one is what you have there as Tagore in Buenos Aires. For if the first great literary boom coming from India in the 20th century is usually associated with the figure of Rabindranath Tagore. Sorry for my pronunciation. One might recall his visit to Buenos Aires at the end of 1924, where he was stranded and ill on his way to Lima, where he never got, when some tricksters who never turned up had invited him to a commemorative festivity in honor of the Incas, which led him to be stuck in Buenos Aires and led to a different kind of encounter and misunderstanding with the very circle that was going to become SUR, the translation machine orchestrated by Silvina Ocampo, of which Borges was a very active member. If in this circle, as we have seen today, it was intended that the constitutive South American fault to be compensated, open up liberally to an equality with the rest of the cultures and languages of the world that should be recognized in an open bidirectional movement of translation, if that was the pretense of this, you saw Borges, I mean, let's take the universe as our inheritance. Well, actually, Tagore makes Silvina Ocampo suffer the disillusionment of asymmetry, the necessary conflict and silence when juxtaposing cultures and languages, even and especially when it is done taking a third language intended as a bridge, as is our case today and was their case at the time. This is the language, the third language is English, of course. When Victoria Ocampo translates for Tagore Baudelaire's L'Invitation au Voyage, Invitation to Travel, title symptomatic in itself, Tagore answers, quote 81, "I don't like your furniture, poet." From the steamship Giulio Cesare, which takes Tagore back to Europe in January 1925, as soon as it set sails, Tagore writes to Ocampo, to Silvina Ocampo, at greater length. Quote 82. This is part of the letter. It's a long letter. "You helped rescue me from a regimented hospitality of a reception committee and allowed me to feel through you the pulse of your country. Unfortunately, the language barrier prevented free communication of minds between us, for you never felt fully at home in the only European language I happen to know. I completely understand the pain which you must have suffered for being unable to express your deeper thoughts to me, and to remove the fog that screened off the world of your intellect from my vision. But never think for a moment that I failed to recognize that you had a mind. To me, it was more like a distant star," this is Bolaño's title, "rather than a dark planet. When we were together, we mostly toyed with words and tried to laugh away our best opportunities to see each other clearly. Such laughter can cloud our minds, raising superfluous dust and blurring our view." Not only humor and laughter, very often untranslatable, but also the very English that Ocampo had learned alongside Spanish and French, which this perfectly trilingual literary woman had always felt as a natural language for her, seems a barrier for Tagore. Even languages, which she always thought of as a bridge without conflict, and first and foremost, this English language, which in her dealings with Virginia Woolf, she wrote with Virginia Woolf a lot of letters, and with Aldous Huxley, had never proved a barrier, becomes a source of insurmountable silences with Tagore. 83, Tagore doubt our understanding of Eastern thought, notes Ocampo in her diary. And when it comes to timidly returning the favor, after having a quartet perform for Tagore the works of Debussy and Ravel that she adored, Ocampo further notes, writes down, this is the continuation of 83, "Our Western music seemed to him to be as muddled and meaningless as the Bengali songs he sang to me sometimes seemed to me at first, unbearably monotonous. I discovered that music is not, as I had imagined, a universal language. Not even the most abstract of languages, music in its pure materiality, would simply cross among cultures." Now, if it is a question of returning the favor in these equivocal translational relations between the booms and busts of India and South America, let me refresh another symptomatic scene from the other end of the century. For if Salman Rushdie is often considered the artificer of a second great literary boom that emerged from India, this time of the novel in the last decades of the 20th century, one might recall his visit to Chile in Santiago in November 1995, where he was invited to close the 15th International Book Fair in Santiago in what was then to be for him an unprecedented public event before a massive audience, where he would also present the Spanish translation of his latest novel, The Moor's Last Sight. But it so happened that as soon as he got off the plane, before the reception committee could even approach him, among whom I was myself, by chance, hired a few weeks earlier as an interpreter by Sudamericana publishing house at the price of silence. That means I was only chosen because they trust I would keep the secret of his visit. So before he was even out of the plane, as I was saying, a platoon of special forces armed to the teeth came out of nowhere and loaded him into a helicopter which flew away with no not known destination. We learned many hours later that he had been transferred to a police safe house where he was held in isolation for the rest of the day. The public talk that he was to give on censorship and freedom of speech at the International Book Fair, this was an event through which the cultural establishment of Chile, which had recently regained democracy, was meant to finally rejoin the map of world culture. So this talk that he was going to give was cancelled by order of the Ministry of Interior. Quote 84, this is many years later, the sub-minister, I, according to the Constitution, had to watch over the safety not only of Mr. Rushdie, but of all Chileans. That's recalled under Secretary Belisario Velasco 25 years later. As for Rushdie, he said, I'm quoting him, I felt like a prisoner in Chile. He told the New York Times a few days after the incident. As a palliative, a talk was organized for the following day at the Centro de Estudios Públicos, which is the think tank of the Chilean liberal right, which is an oxymoron in itself, liberal right in Chile, authorized this time for a limited, hand-picked audience, being the only permitted public activity on which he appeared. I have recorded the way in which, in response to questions from the attendees, the very promise of translation crept in episodically, Rushdie specifying that, I'm quoting him, that if everything one says offends somebody, there is a battle for language. That in Bombay, people begin a sentence in a language and might end it up in a third, speaking about the authentic ways of being Indian in the diaspora, of grafting rhythms of different parts of the world into English, of not getting stuck in the Englishness of England, and so forth. Before closing his statement with what humor he had left with the following sentence, I would only want to say that it is very good to finally have arrived. But above all, there remains a moment in the conversation when asked about his dependence on magical realism, and more precisely on the official head of the Latin American boom, Garcia Marquez, he replied, not without showing a certain impatience. Quote 85, no, I admire Garcia Marquez. I think he's a very great writer. But for me, the real revelation when I was still a university student was Borges. In the middle of the 1960s, nobody knew who Borges was, so I thought I had this sense of Borges being a kind of private pleasure. When I got to England, it was very disappointing to find that he was one of the world's famous writers. Finally, and I'm finishing now, amid the airs of Borges, if many would say that the most recent writer born in the South American cone, or the Southern cone, to have a global impact has been Bolaño himself, and I've witnessed this in a couple of days, many people here read Bolaño. I would like to close here by giving Bolaño the word and the stage with a certain innocence. Believe me, I'm trying to be innocent here as much as I can. I want to just witness, how does it feel to read here, in English translation, just a little part of the very aggressive invective he makes, Bolaño, in Los Mitos de Chuchu, the myths of Chuchu, against the current state of Spanish language literature, dominated as it is by a bestseller policy under the parameters of local color, exoticism, readability, and amenity. Especially insofar as his sarcastic indignation also turns against a long history of Western writers who have idealized the East. So from his extreme west, Bolaño provokes with the following. This is 86, the last in page 12 of the handout. I'll try to read this. In the end, everything is folklore. The novel of Penelope Cruz in India is worthy of our most illustrious stylist. Pe arrives in India. Since she likes local color or authenticity, she goes to eat in one of the worst restaurants in Calcutta or Bombay. Pe's own words. One of the worst, or one of the cheapest, or one of the most down-market places. She sees a hungry little boy at the door who stares back at her fixedly. Pe gets up, goes out, and asks the boy what's the matter. The boy asks if she could give him a glass of milk. Odd, because Pe isn't drinking milk. Nevertheless, our actress gets a glass of milk and takes it to the boy, still at the door. Next step, the boy drinks the glass of milk under Pe's watchful gaze. When he finishes it, Pe tells us the boy's grateful and happy smile leads her to think of all the things she has but doesn't need. Although Pe is wrong here, because everything she has, absolutely everything, she needs. A few days later, Pe has a long philosophical but also practical conversation with Mother Teresa of Calcutta. At a certain moment, she tells her this story, the story of the boy. She talks about the necessary and the superfluous, about being and not being, about being in relation to and not being in relation with, what and how. And then in the end, what is all this about being? Being oneself? Pe is a mess. Meanwhile, Mother Teresa is moving like a rheumatic weasel around the room of the porch that shelters them, while the Calcutta sun, the balmy sun, but also the sun of the living dead, scatters its dying rays as it is drowned away in the west. Yes, yes, says Mother Teresa, and then she murmurs something that Pe doesn't understand. What, says Pe in English? Be yourself. Don't worry about fixing the world, says Mother Teresa. Help, help, help one person. Give a glass of milk to one, and that will be enough. Sponsor one child, just one, and that will be enough, says Mother Teresa in Italian, clearly in a bad mood. As night falls, Pearl returns to the hotel. She takes a shower, changes her clothes, dabs herself with perfume, unable to forget Mother Teresa's words. When dessert is served, suddenly illumination. It's all about taking a tiny pinch of your savings. It's all about not getting distressed. Give an Indian child 12,000 pesetas a year, and you're already doing something. And don't get distressed, and don't feel guilty. Don't smoke, eat dried fruit, and don't have a bad conscience. Thrift and goodness are indissolubly linked. A number of enigmas remain floating like ectoplasm in the air. If Pe went to eat in a cheap restaurant, why didn't she end up with gastroenteritis? And why did Pe, who is not short of cash, eat in a cheap restaurant in the first place? To save money? Well, thank you very much for your attention today. Maybe sit there? Yeah.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. There was so much in this that was distant yet so familiar. I mean, just what you ended on reminded me of Oprah Winfrey's visit to India as well. You know, where she cries because people don't have running water, and that's like a crime against humanity for her. But I was also thinking in terms of the way you're thinking through questions of history and historiography and literature and how all of these things come together. And I'm also, I mean, I grew up in West Bengal, which had a communist government for 30 years. So it was first the Russians, and so we read a lot of Russians. And then Latin America happened. And very quickly people realized that they couldn't do what they did with Russia, with Latin America, because there was so much happening. And this idea of the circularity of time, which gets so exoticized, like, you know, and this is something that I remember, I think it was Wole Soyinka who said as a very offhanded remark, he said that, you know, of course, the West doesn't have history because their time only moves forward. So I was very interested, and after this I'll open it up for questions from the audience as well, but I was very interested in the concept of what you mentioned, I think, the rituals of eternal return, or something to that effect. And I was thinking of ritual as a temporality as well, which is not something that a lot of Western ways of thinking, particularly Eurocentric ways of thinking, think about ritual as an atemporal space. So I was wondering how you think about ritual in this particular frame of this eternal return. And then, like I said, we can open it up to questions from the audience.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, conceptions of history depend on certain conceptions of time. They're not the same. I mean, you have like phenomenological time, and then you have historical time, which is normally what historiography studies. And the fact that it's historiography and not histology already tells you that there's a strong connection between systems of writing and ways of organizing historical time. And then you could find behind different conceptions of times, you have mentioned something more teleological, like the Western idea of time being linear, historical time and leading somewhere. I mean, whoever, I mean, that somewhere can be liberation, or can be it can be the manifestation of the spirit, whatever you want to call the end of history. And then you have like this kind of recursive time, eternal return, which obviously depend in different ways of organizing time. In one case, you have a certain conception of repetition. I remember here, it just came to my mind, a very nice image, which I might not remember exactly, but the image of Walter Benjamin saying that eternal return is like the punishment of remaining after the class projected to the cosmic. So you have to write the same text innumerable times. I mean, it's like a punishment of writing the same text. So it's like this punishment of after school project to cosmic time. And I think there's something about that. Borges used to call it, he wrote a lot about the different versions of eternal return. A very nice one is the Blanqui one, which is, I want to get at that, but it's the logical conclusion of thinking the universe as infinite and atoms as finite. So in the end, all combinations have to repeat endlessly. But Borges called it the most awful idea on the universe, I mean, eternal return. And it obviously depends on a form of repetition. A form of repetition, but that it, in the case of what I was talking in Latin America, this repetition has to be with certain archetypes that are in the, I would say, certain emblematic novels of the boom tend to project these archetypes that they repeat themselves. They would have new clothes in every time from certain things that happened even before the arrivals of the Spanish, especially at the moment of the arrivals of the Spanish, to the dictatorships of the 70s. And I think that that way of reading history, this archetypal, it's definitely in crisis in the sense that it has been a very paralyzing way of reading history, because there are categories that are very wide categories that doesn't allow to analyze well the present when you think it's just a repetition. I'm not saying that there's no abuse, that there's no violence. I mean, writers like Bolaño, I mean, have been few writers that have rescued and portrayed the violence of Latin America as he has done. But it's a violence that has its own present, and that is not simply the repetition of the same struggle structure that throughout history. So obviously that doesn't mean that when you leave behind this kind of eternal return, you follow or you simply agree with a sort of teleology. Actually, the teleology in Latin America was pretty much the idea of time of the 70s, the revolutionary time, the idea that there was a revolution that dialectically was going to change history, and there was going to be an advent of a sort of, not an end of history, but an end of abuse. And this, we all knew how it ended. It ended very badly with the advent of dictatorships. So it's maybe the time of the past, I didn't get into that, and I didn't even think about, but maybe the time of the past has more to do with this kind of, it's a more montage time in which, as they have a more eclectic way of constructing the narrative, they also have a time that has more to do with juxtaposition and events coming out of this juxtaposition. The problem also is that montage that began as a very as a very provocative way of shaping representation, has become pretty much domesticized today by the media. The problem is that this was invented by the avant-garde 100 years ago, precisely to create a sort of meaning and representation that was less intentional and more polyvalent. And we have been raised with this kind of aesthetic device. So we all have these expectations today of events. This is why there's an almost cult of the event, even in philosophy. I mean, the cult of the acontecimiento, the event in philosophy, it's massive. So we have been trained by this new aesthetic device to expect events, to expect epiphany, someone was calling it yesterday. But the problem is that they have been domesticized by the media. So what we just get is anxiety, because we just move through this montage, domesticated montage, from one image to the next one, to the next one, in a sort of static time that promises the event that never comes, and we end all just after consuming pills, I mean, for anxiety. So also, I mean, our present conception of time is very much in crisis, even after teleology of the 70s, and once you move to this kind of montage, one, it has been domesticated by the mass media montage, and it has become really an assemblage. It's not a montage, it's something that is still quite organic. It's just that it promises the effect of the inorganic, but it works very organically. And it doesn't, and the epiphany never comes. I mean, it's just like, it makes you just navigate and navigate and search and search and search and juxtapose images with this sort of anxiety that something's going to happen sometime, and it doesn't. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, and it also reminds me of this idea of temporal derangement as well. I mean, that comes across in poetry. And when you were saying that, I was reminded of the lyrics from that famous song by Victor Jara, Caminando, Caminando. You know, I start walking in search of freedom, and then after a certain point of time, I forget why I'm walking and where I started and where I'm headed to. But yeah, I won't monopolize your time, so I'll just go ahead and open up the session to questions from the audience. Yeah. Do we have a microphone?
Thank you, Andrés. I really enjoyed that talk, I'll be asking you for the text afterwards. But I particularly enjoyed the comments on essay and the idea of, you know, essay as an attempt that's bound to end up in failure. And your characterization, this quotation, "Our America" is an essay. I love the quotation from Montaigne's mother, that he who devotes himself to making essays will not be able to obtain results, right? This sense of knowing that you're going to fail in advance. And Borges, who you sort of characterize here, I think you know, being less of an expert on Latin American literature, but he seems to be characterized as the godfather, right, of the bus generation, right? All his short stories are really essays, right? None of them are longer than, you know, he never writes a text, as we all know, longer than however many pages. But I just was going to ask about Bolaño, really, who oscillates, I mean, I know you quoted from his essays, which I'm afraid I haven't read, I revealed that last night, but he oscillates between this poetry that he never really writes, right? The only poetry we get is this fascist writing in the sky by the, whatever it is, the Chilean Air Force pilot, and these novels that are bust, that are broken, that fail, the Savage Detectives or 2666, are novels that end in failure. But how do you explain, I guess in a sense, how do we understand Bolaño's writing in terms of genre? Why the turn to the novel? Is it simply financial, right? You know, the idea that he needed to make money for his family or he needed to be successful. But where does Bolaño actually, as a writer in the end of these massive novels, fit into your thesis of, right, the condition of perhaps a Southern Cone experience as essayism?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, just a preamble, so since you mentioned Borges, and I've only mentioned that I think that it's very important to understand the presence of essay, to understand the status of Borges' fiction, which is a genre in itself, which makes that his short stories are essays, and his essays many times are like short stories, because he treats the material of the big ideas of Western culture, philosophy, whatever. I mean, he has this boutade. I mean, like the great ideas of philosophy and theology are part of fantastic literature. And it's important to realize that because Borges is seen as a very conservative, and not only in politics, and that is true. I mean, he was painfully conservative, but in his writing, he's seen as someone that has a very polished and conservative style, and he's a very avant-garde writer. But it's not in his prose. That is a very contained prose. I mean, very Anglophile in a way. But he taught. I mean, people that like Cortázar learned everything, and he says it from Borges. And Cortázar's prose is very Baroque in a way, especially in Rayuela. But also his avant-gardism in the case of Borges comes from this essayism that it's also a way of writing reading. I mean, Borges always writes while reading. He doesn't write, you see, he doesn't sit and say what he wants to say. Even when he does interviews, he quotes passages from his own writings all the time. So he's a writer that expresses himself through the reading of other texts. And that is a very avant-garde way for him to do text, and has a lot to do with the technique of essay, where you're normally like talking about different things happening in different texts. Then going to Bolaño, again, a little preamble. I mean, Bolaño wrote an enormous amount of poetry, which is mostly published in Spanish. Today has been republished, some of it, but he published poetry books since his 20s. And this is his great, between quotation marks, failure. I mean, he wanted to be recognized as a poet. There's a little biography there. Maybe I have it in the text. I don't remember. I think I have it there, where Bolaño is asked to describe himself. And he said, like, I've written, whatever, this number of poetry books that are that no one has read, and then he puts a parenthesis, which is probably okay. And I read some novels that people tend to be reading now, which is okay also. But he wanted to be a poet, and he wrote a lot of poetry till the end, but he was never known as a poet. He's not important as a poet in Latin American culture. Everything he writes also has a big influence of Nicanor Parra, who is a Chilean poet, very big Chilean poet, that invented this kind of poetry and anti-poetry. Is the tradition of Laforgue, of T.S. Eliot, of Prufrock. I mean, the idea of this poetry that boycotts its own prosody and is always putting into doubt prosodically what it's saying. And Bolaño, that's his tradition. And now his prose in the novels changes. I mean, it's not the same in every novel. I mean, like Detective, how it's called, Detectives Salvajes, the Savage Detectives, has a prose that is probably with 2666, which you could classify. But then there are other books that are a little bit more conventional. And he has something in his prose that for me, we were talking about that yesterday, that I always relate, not always, but I recently relate more to Swift, which is this kind of, he doesn't have depthness. It's all on the surface in Bolaño. People have sometimes criticized him because his characters don't have psychological depthness. That's nothing to criticize. He tends to write putting a situation in your face and not interpreting how people are feeling, and that I don't know how that will relate to essayism, but I would definitely say that the sort of eclecticism between the short story that is very important for Bolaño. I think that he cared much more about short story, and that's why he was a great admirer of Borges, mainly short stories. The short story of Bolaño and the diary definitely come into the novel and completely transform the way he writes the novel in this kind of very flat texture. Now, you spoke about his essays. I would call them maybe chronicles, little columns. There are some speeches. That book, which is published in English, is published as between parentheses. Is even online. I know because I took it down online to get some of the English, which is not where the conference on the myth of Chulchu is. That it's also translated into English, but that's part of a short story book which is called El Gaucho Insufrible, the Unsufferable Gaucho, I suppose. And that's where you will have the Chulchu thing of where Pe comes to India. And those conferences and all the material was basically on demand in the last years of his life because he needed money. I know very well the story because, I mean, most of those columns come in a newspaper in Chile which is called Las Últimas Noticias, a very small newspaper and very popular, no culture whatsoever, but had Andrés Breadway directing the cultural section. And he would invite Bolaño, Vila Matas, people of that stature. There was, when he was starting Zambra and others, to write one every day. So he had this kind of elite of the Hispano-American writing in this like nowhere newspaper in Chile. And they wrote, because they wrote during years for this music. When Andrés Breadway would get to Barcelona, he was carrying the cash with him, so everyone was waiting for him in the airport. And so that's the way it happened, that he was writing during every week for 2 or 3 years, in the end, last years of his life, for money, this weekly columns that had 1-2 pages. And they are fantastic. They're absolutely fantastic. He also has a prose much more free than his novels. Normally, he writes from beginning to end without a single point, the whole column, so it's like 2 pages without punctuation. And this was published in this newspaper that, I mean, we read it online, I mean, because we were waiting for this column. But in terms of paper, I mean, it was, again, this kind of weird story. And that's where his work as a essayist, or as in more precise terms, comes from. So again, he wanted to be a poet. That never happened, but he published a lot of poetry. I think that those testimonial little pieces in between parentheses are among his greatest writing, and that was on command to live. Now, again, we're talking, I will finish with this, the story about Bolaño. He knew very well how the market worked, and he operated with that. He even cynically operated with that, I think. But the story that he was writing 2666 to keep money for the children, it's not. I don't think it's like that. He did write to many writers in Mexico, some of whom I know, for years, asking information about Juarez, for years. Before the novel was, I mean, a decade before the novel was written, I mean, he was already gathering information about that. So I think that novel was pretty much a big project that he always had. Different is that in the last year or so, he completely enclosed himself. He didn't do any, I mean, he was very, very, very hermetic. And he kept on writing because he knew that things were not going very well. I mean, he obviously did the mistake of not getting into the list for a transplant on time. Because he was always like ambiguous about his accepting that he had this problem. So when he got into the list, it didn't, and he had a special blood group. So it took time, and then he didn't manage to get the liver. But he, yeah, it's true that he enclosed himself at the end. But that was at the end. I mean, he was writing this, and this was a project that he had for many years. I think that. It's difficult to think that something as, I wouldn't say a cathedral, because precisely it's quite open on all sides, but as monstrous in the good sense of the word, would have been just improvised to get out of, or to get some money. Actually, if they had wanted money, probably it would have been much better to publish several short novels, and yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I was, sorry, just quick follow. I was asking whether we could understand his novels as forms of essayism, and your quote 57 actually here, right, you know, makes something of that point. The novel of the 21st century, a hybrid novel
Yeah.
that brings together the best of short story, journalism, chronicle,
Yeah.
and the diary.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a way of understanding these
There are, yeah, that
sort of essayistic novels, even if they are, you know, 1,000 pages long.
yeah. No, that was what I was saying, that he brought into the novel the essay, he brought journalism, he brought the diary, and also he invented this kind of texture, which is, I always feel that it's quite, in a good sense, but it's quite flat. You don't, I mean, everything is there to see. That's why I was saying just that it reminded me of Swift. And in one of those little essays or little chronicles in between parentheses, he speaks about Swift, which was, I mean, no one, I mean, and he speaks about Swift, and he definitely had read Swift very well. And Swift has that in the Gulliver Travels, that there's no deafness. everything is there to see. Obviously, it's very ironic, and that doesn't mean that there are not several meanings. But the meanings are not concealed in the more and the more metaphorical tradition. It's all there. I mean, Swift almost nowhere uses metaphors in the same way that Bolaño doesn't try to make the psychological deafness of his characters commented on. It's just shown by their attitudes. You have to deduce it from something that is very plain and surface. I think that also comes from the fact of the way that he mixes journalism, diary, that it gives like a sort of special texture, which is very unique.
So Sanchit, who like the faithful double bass in a jazz ensemble, who's the keeper of our time, is telling us we must conclude. So thank you so much for that talk, and thank you all of you. And I'm sure the conversation will continue outside as well. So yeah.
Yes, most certainly. I must add, our time is linear, but it's certainly cyclical in the sense that I heard Professor Claro's talk as a conversation with the previous symposium on the writer, critic, and literary studies, as well as another symposium on failing. So thank you again, Professor Claro, for, dare I say, presenting to us a boom of references and reverences. And thanks to Dr. Kumar for chairing the session. We'll break quickly for tea and be back. Thank you.